Some of the teachers are.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
So we should wait for us to be around 100 people.
Yeah, 90 approximately.
Okay, so let's wait another 5 minutes, perhaps.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
Mario,
Ciao,
can I ask a question to you?
Yes.
Just for clarification, all the PhD students of the school will follow this.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just.
No, CU2, CU2. Yes, this is a multidisciplinary event. So it's, you know, we are focusing now on the topics related with the CU2, but the attendees are all the PhD students in the
Okay,
course.
thank you very much.
I've started the YouTube streaming and I'll start the recording now, Elisa, if you want.
Yeah, let's wait for another few minutes because I see people arriving.
Yeah, so before starting the recording, just let me ask you, did you encounter problem with the learning test? No, no technical problems. Okay, very well. Okay, let me start the recording.
Okay, we're now 68 people. Mario, you tell me when it's time.
I think we can start, Elisa, and
so let me share the screen. Okay, so I shared the screen and then I shared this slideshow from beginning. Can you see the screen? Like,
yes.
Of course, yeah. Okay, good. So everyone, good morning. I'm Elisa Giuliani. I'm the coordinator of Curriculum 2, Socioeconomic Risks and Impacts. And so I'm introducing this module today, and then I will leave the floor to my colleagues who will give like mini lectures for this course. Okay, just 1 second. We are now, so let me see how it works here. Just 1 second. I see 71 people, so people are joining. So let's wait 2 minutes and then I start with this. Okay, so let's start. I think it's time now. So basically, let me just introduce you to the module, to CU curriculum number 2 and what it is about. Essentially, CU2 is about understanding whether and how economic systems are both responsible for sustainability challenges, but also can be functional to fix sustainability problems and can resist, survive, transform themselves as they address sustainability challenges. Let me just say a few words about what we mean by economic systems, because when we see economic system, we both think about some macro level organization of the economic apparatus, thus including the functioning of the economic systems and the financial systems, but also we are interested in understanding the individual actors belonging to this economic system, so firms, banks, and their interactions with different types of institutional actors, as well as the civil society and communities at large. Also, when we talk about sustainability, we have to keep in mind that 2015 UN agenda. So the word sustainability really refers to a wealth of topics and issues and challenges and problems societies and contemporary capitalism has to address in the next decades. Of course, the lecture today and what you've seen so far also from the other presentations from the other curricula has a big focus on one of the most pressing and urgent challenges, which is climate change. You've also seen how climate change is also related to and interconnected with the other sustainability challenges of the 2015 UN agenda. But of course, here we have a specific interest in understanding how economic systems interact with, are responsible for, as well as survive and transform themselves in the face of climate change. Now, let me just introduce you to the journey today and therefore to the lectures. The lectures have been organized across around 4 key topics, and you will have a number of speakers for each topic. I hope it's not going to look too fragmented, but I feel that most of the lecturers and most of the professors in our curriculum wanted to contribute, wanted to actually have an interaction with you. So I thought it was a good idea to give most of them the opportunity to have a small talk today. So the journey is first starting with climate risks, and particularly we're going to talk about physical and transition risks, which probably you've heard about in the last days too. But mostly what we are interested in is how economic systems, both macro and micro levels, react to physical and transition risks. We're also touching upon how the transition to a lower carbon society is going to generate economic and financial risks. And we're also going to look at and to discuss briefly about how climate change risks impact on the labor market. The second block is more focused on finance. Of course, finance is a key component of the economic systems, and also finance has been associated and discussed about in terms of how they can help actually address the climate change risks. And so we are going to talk a little bit about sustainable finance and with some specific reference also to individual type of financiers like venture capitalists. And we're also going to talk about fintech, that is, the technology side of the financial market, how technology has changed the financial market, particularly how artificial intelligence has generated market systemic risks, and also how that changes and impacts on environmental, social, and governance factors. And you will hear about ESG, environment, social, and governance, a lot in this module and also in the curricula training, because ESG refer actually to this, if you want, it's a business jargon for identifying the sustainability challenges companies face. Third, we are going then to move on from more macro level discussions to firms and to the business sectors. And we're going to talk about circular economy and green business models. Today we're going to talk about green startups, but also what is the circular economy, what it entails, what are the risks. It's a very fashionable term, but what is really, what it really means, and how can we successfully become a circular economy through the work of companies. And we are going to talk also about voluntary ESG frameworks, that is, companies adopting a number of voluntary initiatives to address ESG factors and risks. Finally, we are going to talk about sustainable mobility. Sustainable mobility and transport of goods and people are key for sustaining economic activities, as you can imagine, and therefore ensuring that we have the infrastructure that addresses, the changes and the transformation to a low carbon society that reduces environmental and climate change impacts is fundamental also on economic terms. So this is today's journey in terms of topics, and these are like the speakers for each of the blocks, also with the timetable that have been circulated already. You see here because of like the length of the different blocks, we are going to have like a break at around 12:30, and then we resume at around 2:30. So we are going to have a different schedule as compared to yesterday. Okay, so having said that, I would leave the floor to the first speaker. So I think it's Mario, and then the rest will follow. I will keep the time, and I'm not sure I kept the time myself, but I will try to, be to the conclusion, okay? So that you can wrap up and conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you. I'll start sharing my screen. And okay, you should see now my screen. I will start giving you a panorama in the context of climate risk and impacts from the perspective of modelers, engineers like me, Francesco Ballio, and Giuseppe Aronica. We are working CU2 on different aspects of the risk assessment exercise. I will first very briefly repeat what is risk from our perspective, give you some reasons on why we need to assess risk, and then some tools how to assess risk in the context of climate risk. In the previous presentations, you already seen some definitions of what is risk, and I'm gonna just very briefly repeat that for us, the three main components defining risk are HUDs, vulnerability, and exposure. This is a way somehow to organize the algorithm, the methodologies to assess the risk. The hazard refers to the probability ingredient, because we want to know how probable is the occurrence of an event that we consider potentially damaging. Second is the vulnerability, which actually assesses the relative damage on a certain asset. And third is the exposure, which is the value of that asset. Because of these, risk is measured in our model usually using monetary terms, and it is also referring to a value, the damage, a loss. For example, just to simplify with a very simple example, if I want to assess the risk of flood for this house, then first I need to assess the hazard. So I can probably say the probability of a flood is 20%. Then I need to assess the consequences in terms of damages. And for instance, the damage of this house could be 30% because of a flood. And third, I need to estimate, given some criteria, the value of this house. And let's imagine it's 100,000 euro. Just using the simplest formula, I can imagine of the risk, which is the product of these three factors. By multiplying these three factors, then I get a value, 6,000 euro. What is 6,000 euros in the context is the risk, which is the expected damage due to the flood. But why do we need to assess risk? Well, usually we are, very often we are in front of options. We want to choose between option A and option B, where option A, we can measure the pro and we can measure the cons, and also for option B, we can measure the advantage and the disadvantage. And usually decisions is making a comparison between these two options, and we usually choose the best option, of course. Unfortunately, however, we face uncertainty. What it does mean that for these options, it's not always possible to express the different factors with certainty. Some of those are uncertain. So in this context, then, why we need to assess risk? Because we want to make decisions, and making the decisions usually means compare options. Case B could be an option where I have all the information that I need, but for case A, probably I could have some of these factors which are uncertain. And risk is a tool, is a way, is a method to translate an uncertain but probable event into a measurable and comparable entity. So making decisions could be also compare not just two options, but also compare for the same option the cost and the benefit. To go back to the example I was making before, if option A is just leaving the house as it is and the risk is 6,000 euro, well, option B could be to make some works to reduce the vulnerability of that house, and to reduce the vulnerability of that house from 30% to 10%, it means that I need to make some works for 3,000 euro. In this case, if applying the same simple formula I showed with you before, I can reduce risk from 6,000 to 2,000. Well, I can say that in this case, I get a benefit of 4,000. So I have here now the costs and the benefit of this option. I can put on the weighting plates of the scale and say, well, the benefits are higher than the costs, so I can make now a decision, thanks to the risk simple formula. Well, however, besides the uncertainty, we always face some irrationality in making the decisions. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you are participating to a lottery and you already won 10,000 euro. Well, now you have a bonus, and you can make a decision that if you leave this lottery, well, you get 5,000 more than what you already won. Instead, if you want to bet again, you can win or not 10,000 euro. Same situation, but in this case now, you already won 20,000 euro, and now you get a penalty. If you leave, you need to leave 5,000 euro on the table. Instead, if you bet again, you can probably lose 10,000 euro instead of 5,000 euro. Where, believe me that with these sort of experiments, although by using the risk definition I gave you, the results in these two different conditions is exactly the same, well, the decision is completely different because there is an irrational behavior behind the decision. Another problem we face when we make decisions related with risk is that usually in the context of climate risk, we deal with rare events. Again, let me give you an example. Imagine that you are sitting in a bus stop, and in that bus stop, we know that there are different buses passing by. The blue bus with a certain frequency, with certain timetable, the red bus, and the orange bus. Now imagine that you set for a certain period within a time window in the bus stop. Well, by just observing within the time window the buses on that bus stop, you could probably conclude that just 3 buses will go in that stop. Unfortunately, however, there is a much more rare bus, which is the yellow bus, which still go through the stop, but unfortunately, because it is rare, was not observed. So using the observation for extreme events is not enough. Also, there is a fourth keyword I would like to highlight: complexity. Because in the context of climate risk, we deal with the complex systems. Complex systems are very often encountered in our analysis, not just in climate risk. Our body is a complex system. The hive is a complex system. The urban system, our society is a complex system, but also our climatic model, a climatic system, is a complex system, which means that unfortunately the evolution of a certain phenomena and the evolution, the propagation of certain perturbation of the system, of the state of the system, are very, very difficult to simulate, to predict, and are very impossible to predict just based on our experience. So given this context, uncertainty, rationality, rare events, and complexity, well, to make an assessment of risk, to make decisions, we need proper tools. That's why we need models. Models help us to solve and to estimate the risk in this context. But how do we assess risk? So repeat, we define risk in a very simple way as the combination of three factors, three components. Unfortunately, in the real case, it's not that simple as I said before. There are not just the three factors that need to be to multiply by, but behind this component, there are more variables, more functions that we need to consider. For instance, the hazard is not just a simple number, is a relationship between the intensity of the event that I'm considering and its probability. The vulnerability will be depending, so the relative damage I can have depends on the intensity of the event. And also the exposure is a combination of different factors. So given this context, even in a slightly more complex way, so the risk is not anymore a number, is a curve representing the probability of different damages, of different scenarios. For example, again, let me give you an example slightly more difficult than the example I gave you before. So imagine that I want to assess the risk for this bridge due to landslide. Well, I can apply the concept of the risk as before, but now for my hazard, I have a curve representing different probability for different scenarios, referring, for instance, to the intensity of the precipitation that could trigger the landslide. Then also the vulnerability is not a simple number, is a curve representing for each of those scenarios the potential damage can occur or due to the activation of the landslide. And also the exposure is not that simple to estimate. I can use analytical methods or synthetic method to get an estimation of the value, but also more important than that, I need to estimate, to use and decide what is the criteria to estimate that value. Well, putting together all this information now, the risk is not just a simple number, is a curve, and of course, the higher is the damage and the lower will be the probability of occurrence. And what we get is what we call the risk curve. Now we can have the full range of options and scenarios with different damages, and there are different metrics describing now the risk. One of the most easy of the metrics is just computing the average, the expected value. The expected value of that curve corresponds to the area under the curve. Well, now I can use that number for my decision-making process, comparing that expected damage with the cost. I can make simulations. I can do what I need to actually make the decision. Well, all these things that I describe are a little bit more complex because I need to consider different things, but conceptually are the same in our risk models. I have, components describing the hazard based, for instance, on historical data, on predictions in the future scenarios. I have models describing the vulnerability by stressing all the assets and points I want to make the analysis for. And then I have also the economic component, trying to assess not just the value for that asset, but also to predict how that value will change in the future. all these is embedded into a model. And this model will link all these components to get at the end a description of the risk in mathematical terms, like for instance, using the risk curve I was describing before. Well, in the context of climate risk, I need to repeat this exercise not just for one event, for one phenomenon, but I need to repeat for many hazards. That's why we usually call also our model multi-hazards. For instance, for flood, heat waves, wind, landslide, drought, extreme weather in general, and other natural events, I would repeat just by substituting to each of these components the proper approach to get at the end a description for each of these damage of the economic impact, the risk. Well, actually, things are even more complex than I'm describing, because when we deal with a complex system, there is not just the assessment of one single site. I want to consider the system as a whole. And the system as a whole is a complex mixture set of relationship, dependency between multiple nodes, multiple assets. For this reason, I do not need just to estimate the risk, the impact for one point, but I need also to make a propagation, to simulate the propagation of the impact. Just to give you an example, if a certain event, a certain phenomena will hit point A, well, actually, there is the first level of the modeling where, based on the intensity of the event, will estimate the damage. But also we know that A is providing a service, or in any case will give an impact also on B. For instance, thinking to two different enterprises, there is a certain production that can be affected because of that level of damage. And at the third level, well, given the reduction, the business interruption, we could say on site A, there will be also an effect, an impact on site B. This is what we call impart propagation, and is also modeled by our tools. And we usually call site A site which is directly impacted by the phenomena, and site B a site which is indirectly impacted. That's why we call indirect impacts in most of our models. Just to give you a little bit of a view within these sort of models, we say that in our models we go from a global scale to a local scale, and then we go back to the global scale. What I mean that most of the information on the input data that we need in our models can be estimated just on a global scale, and the climate risk can be estimated based on the entire globe, because the relationship between the variables are just at that scale. Then I need to project in the future what would be a certain scenario given some assumptions, and they need for that scenario to assess the hazard, which is the probability of occurrence of certain phenomena, for instance, extreme weather. Well, I need now to compute the damage. I need to go to the local scale, because just on the local scale it's possible to estimate the consequences of that scenario, of that impact. Talking about, for instance, the system of enterprises, I need for each of them to estimate of the different assets of the enterprise. So building, for instance, machinery and inventory, I need to estimate the damage. And the direct damage on these assets have an effect on the business interruption of that enterprise. By putting together in a sort of network the effect of this domino effect, I can then estimate on the country level or on an administrative level I choose the risk by assessing it by using some metrics like the expected value I was showing before. And again, I can go back to the global scale where now I can make decisions and I can probably help to build policies. In the context of our PhD, in our curriculum, for instance, we use risk for different applications. We use risk, for instance, for planning. There is Francesco Baglio, his team that is working very heavily on these aspects. To give you an example, Francesco is working on the Po water district. Po is a big river in Italy, where is a very complex systems where we need not just to assess the risk for a certain dimension, a certain element, but for multiple elements, for multiple criteria, for not just the safety of people, but also for infrastructures, for the economic activities, for the cultural and environmental heritage. I mean, there are different layers we need to consider. And these, because at the end, we need to pass the information, that this technical assessment, to people where actually people who actually will make the decision, what we call decision makers. And this is the basis for planning, very, very important. A second application is designing, and there is the group of Giuseppe Aronica working very heavily on this concept, because the traditional way of designing infrastructures, for instance, is a little bit limited to the concept of the hazard, is not considering risk as a whole. But we are working on the definition, what we call risk-based design, where actually when we need to design an infrastructure on the territory, we do not consider just the return period of the probability of an event as the input information, but we make already this cost-benefit analysis I was mentioning before, to choose the level of protection, the cost, the dimension of that infrastructure in order to optimize the cost-benefit ratio. And the third application we are also working on is managing risk. One of the possibility to managing risk, very interesting now for climate risk, is, for instance, what we call risk financing. Risk financing is to determine how we can probably pay for the loss due to the risk. A typical example is the insurance world, but there are different ways to finance risk, thinking to other important components. Here, for instance, in the agriculture, the farmers are a very fragile component of the system, and by putting in place models which actually can provide funding in the right time to recover from loss, will certainly speed and let the economy, the local economy, grow. In this context, we are working with some specific type of models that can help in putting together the system. What we call, so these models are exactly the same I was describing before in terms of components, because they embed hazard, vulnerability, and the exposure, and they are used both to assess the risk, so what we call disaster risk assessment, but also they are real-time tools to pay the loss when the event will occur. This is what usually is called parametric insurance. The key of the parametric insurance is that an event is not anymore adjusted by experts in situ, but they are pre-computed by models, by computers. And for this reason, in a very short time period, we can get out of this information related with the related to the loss and related to the payout, to the indemnity that we can, in a very short time frame, pay to the damaged people. The applications of these, we made application of these in the context of, for instance, agriculture, both for flood and for drought. And this type of model are also called near real-time loss estimation model, or also weather index model. We apply that also by using different type of models like machine learning, and we use machine learning to identify the event for what we call index insurance, and results are very promising because in this way we can predict events like flood. We can identify events like flood with 87% precision, or drought with a precision of 95%. Very, very good in order to rely on this type of model for making a payout for the financial market. But also we are using this type of model to predict the yield, for instance, due to the climate change and to the climate variability of that area. Well, here I can show, for instance, the milk production forecast in the Dominican Republic, where we have the observed milk and the model milk, and imagine that with about a few months, almost 1 year of anticipation, you can predict, and then you can also try to be prepared to the loss due to the yield reduction of the field. Well, more generally, what we can do in the context of our PhD is to couple models, couple different type of models. For instance, the idea, and Alessandro Caiani will talk about these in a minute, is to couple, for instance, climate and economic models, considering the different sectors of our economy, and considering not just the direct, but also the indirect. But more generally, we would like to build what we call integrated models, considering the three components: the climate, social, and economic component. In this way, the climate part will give the conditions to assess the hazards, not just the phenomena, but all the possible impact we have on our economy, producing stress. And we would like to also use macro and micro economic models to estimate the effect. Also, there is here is represented as a cycle, because society itself can perturbate the climate, for instance, reducing or increasing the emissions. That's why this model is an integrated model. And just in the context like our PhD, we can put together all these components because we have this multidisciplinary approach. Thank you, and I would like to thank also Francesco Baglio, Daniela Molinari, Giuseppe Aronica, Marcello Arosio, Luigi Cesarini, Beatrice Monteleone, and Rui Figurator are working on this project. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you also for being on time. So as Caiani uploads his slides, perhaps is the next speaker, Alessandro. There are some questions in the chat. Mario, I don't know if you want to answer in the chat or take one. We have very little time, but there's one.
I will answer in the chat, so Alessandro
okay.
can start.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Some of them you might have answered already, but okay, Alessandro, your time. The floor is yours.
Yeah, just give me a sec. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Or I'm still muted? No.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So, good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here in this first multidisciplinary event of our national PhD. The lecture that I'm giving today is joint with Elena Paglialunga from the University of Urbino, who was actually supposed to give this lecture, but unfortunately some unexpected issues prevent her from presenting today. So I'll try to do my best to keep up with expectations and replace such a talented scholar. but I have to say that I'm relatively novel to this field of study, as I come from non-environmental macroeconomic modeling. So it's just in the last year and a half that I'm starting to deal with these issues. And today, in the next 20 minutes, I'll try to give you an overview of the types of the nature of the different risks that are associated to climate change. And in particular, we will focus on 3 broad categories that have been identified within the economic literature. So the first one, which is the one most investigated in the literature, is related to the physical risks that also Mario has touched in his presentation. So those risks that are arising from climate change itself. And we will see the different types of socioeconomic impacts that climate change is recognized to exert on our socioeconomic system. And we will stress how these impacts are unevenly distributed under a number of different dimensions. And finally, we will also stress the importance of accounting both for the direct impacts of climate change and for the induced, or if you prefer, indirect impacts. So to go beyond the direct impacts in order to consider the overall cost of climate change. As you can imagine, understanding, assessing, and measuring in economic terms, that is, giving a monetary value to the cost of climate change, is in many cases a very tricky challenge. In particular for those dimensions for which we don't have market prices, like, for example, if we have to give a value to biodiversity loss. So we will see some of the issues that we have to face in that respect. The second class of risks instead has been investigated only more recently, but is gaining importance and relevance in the last year. And it is related not so much to the direct consequences of climate change, but rather to the need to foster a rapid and prompt transition from a carbon-intensive to a low-carbon economy. Okay? And as you can imagine, this poses a number of challenges for our economic system that are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels and on, in general, carbon-intensive technologies. So we have different drivers of transition risk. We will mention some of them, ranging from technological drivers, so the fact that most of the technology employed in productive sector is still carbon-intensive, policy and regulatory drivers. So the impact that policies to mitigate climate change may exert on the profitability of businesses, and so also on the price paid by consumers, for example. And finally, there are also transition risks that are related to the change in the sentiment of both consumer and investors, as we are more and more aware of the potential threats to the economy posed by climate change, and at the same time more and more demanding as a stakeholder about the responsibility of the businesses in which they invest or from which they purchase their goods or services. And to these 2 broad classes that are those you usually find in the literature, I also added a third one, which is often included in the previous 2, because it is inherently connected to both physical and transition risk and to the cost arising from these types of hazards. And it is the liability risks that basically refer to the problem of identifying who is responsible, or if you want, accountable for this negative effect of climate change and of the necessary transition to a green economy, and then who should pay the compensation and the cost of the policies to tackle climate change. So as you can imagine, this is something which is almost impossible to do at the micro level, at individual level. So if the value of my house, for example, is falling down because it is located in an area which is more and more frequently subject to landslides or to floods, it's difficult to identify a unique responsible who should pay for it. But as we move towards more aggregate level, things become a little bit clearer. And in particular, we now know, for example, that poorer countries tend to be, as we will see in a couple of slides, more impacted by the negative hazards connected to climate change, whereas we were those contributing the least to greenhouse gases emissions. So also measuring the contribution to greenhouse gases emissions and to climate change in order to find a regulatory scheme to split the burden of the policies required to tackle it is a crucial aspect. And the economic literature has provided different methods following different logics to measure the responsibility of countries, of economic sectors, and so on and so forth. So let's focus on the first class of risks, climate-related physical risks. So starting from the fact that, in a nutshell, we define by climate change the change in the pattern of climate that can be more or less attributed to anthropogenic activities, even though this is well debated also within the climate field. But what is important from our perspective is that we have two dimensions of climate change. So we have both long-term and gradual and progressive phenomena and changes like the rise in temperature, the rise in sea levels, the process of desertification or the process of acidification of oceans. And these clearly exert an impact in the long run on our economic system. So think about the impact of desertification on the agricultural sector, or the impact that the rise of sea levels may exert on counties placed over the coastal lines of our countries. But beside this type of phenomena, we also have a change in the frequency and magnitude and intensity of extreme weather events. That means that the distribution of the outcome of climate is becoming more and more fat-tailed as a consequence of climate change, and so even more unpredictable. And this second class is very important in driving the economic cost connected to climate change. So you can easily see how these extreme events, for example, a heat wave, may affect, for example, the productivity of the workers who work in a certain area which is subject to frequent heat waves, or how floods or hurricanes can destroy the physical facilities of companies, and so hamper or corrupt their productive capacity, or we may damage crucial infrastructure like streets, for example, so preventing workers from going to work. Or in the case of desertification, we might foster outward migration flows, so impacting on the availability of the labor force within a country. All these crucial aspects clearly exert a huge impact on a country's economy, okay? In this slide, you see a number of dimensions on socioeconomic dimension on which climate change have been proven to exert a significant, in a statistical and econometric terms, impact. So you see that they are very diverse and heterogeneous, and we have purely economic ones, for example, like the impact on the aggregate level of output, or on GDP, for example, or the impact on sectoral output, like for agriculture, or on labor productivity. But you also have social and political variables, like the level of conflict and political stability, or you have also natural dimension to which economists nonetheless try to give an economic value, like biodiversity, for example. And this, again, is very tricky because we don't have a market price for that. But also biodiversity loss, for example, is included in the economic damages, also in the IPCC reports, for example. And clearly, the debate about the right way to measure them is far from being settled. So it's a continuous dispute about it. An important aspect connected to these damages is that they are inherently characterized by an intergenerational issue or conflict, if you want. That is, we have what in economics we call a trade-off. Maybe a more intuitive way to define it is a conflict between different objectives. So on the one hand, we have to bear today the cost for implementing policies to mitigate climate change, but we know that the benefits will only arise in the future. So will increase the welfare of future generation, not the current one. Or vice versa, we know that if we save money today not acting, then this will create a damage for future generation. And so there is problem of taking into account the costs that have to be borne today, and the benefits that will only arise in the future. But if you think about it, also the damages that we are experiencing today are the result of past decision. So how can we discount, for example, the welfare of future generation? This is another hugely debated aspect. For example, in integrated assessment models that also Mario was mentioning in his presentation, and then are used within the IPCC reports, and are used to define policies, and also to define in particular the social cost of emitting carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And a key aspect of defining this cost is exactly how we measure the welfare of future generation compared to the welfare of current one who should act. Okay, and in particular, this is proxied by a discount factor of the utility of future generation. And there is a huge debate about the value of this discount factor, which brings very diverse and very wide approximation of the today's right social cost of carbon dioxide, which is crucial in turn in order to define, for example, the right level of a carbon tax. So as you can see, this is a very important aspect. And here is just the trend in the emissions of greenhouse gases over the last decades, just to show that we have this rather constant increasing trend, and to show that the outcome of climate that we are experiencing today are already the results of decisions taken in the past, which is, I think, pretty intuitive, as you can see. Another aspect related to the physical damages of climate change, to the physical risk of climate change, is their uneven distribution also from a geographical point of view. In particular, if you look at poor versus rich countries. So as I was mentioning before, poorer countries are those most vulnerable to climate change. And it is important to understand that the vulnerability or the dimension, the magnitude of the potential economic damages of climate change is a result of a complex system of dimensions of different factors. It is not just the predisposition to be adversely affected depending on the features of the particular climate in a given region. So, for example, the fact of being more or less exposed to floods or heat waves. It is not just the features of the productive structure of a country. So the fact of being specialized in a certain sector rather than in others, that clearly affect the vulnerability compared to certain type of hazards. Agriculture is far more exposed to floods or drought than manufacturers, for example. But it's also a matter of institutions, for example, of quality of institution, and of cultural aspect that overall determine the ability to adapt to the negative effect of climate change. So it is not just one of these factors, but it's the complex combination of all these aspects. And this is a crucial dimension to keep always in mind. But as you can see from this uneven distribution of the outcome of climate change, then it is also important to try to define the right techniques to understand the contribution of each country, for example, to climate change, to greenhouse gases emission, in order to define regulatory schemes that can split the burden of the policies in a fair way. And so we have within the economic literature different methods to try to compute the footprint of different countries. Some are based on production and emission of production processes taking place within the borders of a country, for example, in the Kyoto Protocol. And some instead are based on consumption. So we look at the emission not produced within the countries, but emissions that are embedded in the overall production of the goods and services that are consumed by a country's citizens. So also taking into account emissions that are produced abroad, but embedded in goods that are then imported in a given country. So this was also a way to avoid the so-called carbon leakage, that is country trying to outsourcing their emission rather than abating them, typically outsourcing towards developing countries. And it is not just a matter of poor country versus rich country, north versus the south of the world, but it's also a matter of, but the effects are also heterogeneous within countries. So here you see some maps which project the potential cost under several dimensions up to 15 years. I kind of remember 15 years, yeah, in the United States, in the different counties of the United States. And as you can see, in many of them, the most critical part is represented by the Southeast. And in general, these maps show that we can likely expect a flow of resources from the Southwest to the north, to the Southeast, sorry, to the Northwest. So there is this uneven distribution of the outcome of climate change also within countries, and as you can imagine, also between different social groups within a country, as poorer people might be less capable of adapting to climate change because they have less means at their disposal, and so they are less equipped to face for example, the impact of weather extreme event. Think about Hurricane Katrina, for example, and the damages in the south of the United States. Another crucial aspect is that besides direct cost, we also have to consider the indirect costs. And these indirect costs typically arise from the propagation of the original direct impacts of climate change. And this propagation mainly occurs through production and financial network. So for example, if a facility is impacted and so the machinery of a plant are destroyed, this obviously has a huge impact on the profitability of that company. And this will reflect also in the value of its stock. And so this will reflect also in the wealth of those who have invested in that firm, or the wealth of banks who have granted loans in the past to that firms to realize investment that now have been destroyed by the flood. But typically, they also propagate through the production network. And here I put a graphical example of it, where you can see a stylized economy composed of 4 sectors. We have manufacture on the top, then agriculture, high-tech services, and low-tech services, like hotel and restaurants, for example. And the green arrows tell us that every sector purchases some of the inputs that it uses in its own production process from the other sectors of the economy. And vice versa, every sector sells part of its output to the other sectors that use that output as an input in their own production processes. So we have this network of industrial relationship between different sectors that in economic terms is defined as an input-output description of our economic system. And for sure, we also have every sector selling their output to partly, at least, to households who purchase them for consumption purposes through their final demand. Production processes require workers, and workers receive a wage and income in exchange for the labor force. So now we can see what happens when an extreme event hits one of these sectors. So for example, a flood hitting the manufacturers, some companies in the manufacturing sector. So the direct impacts are, first of all, a reduction in the level of activities of the sector, of the companies that are hit by this weather extreme event. Some machinery now is broken and can no longer be used for production purposes. And clearly also the workers working for that company may experience a loss of income because they cannot go to work, for example, because a street now is flooded, or because they no longer have machineries to operate. And so we have this direct impact. This sector is no longer able to provide inputs to the others demanded by the other sector and to provide a consumption good to the household sector. But then we also have indirect effects. So these unplaced orders to the of the other sectors may hamper their own production facility. Since now the other sector are lacking some inputs, they might not be able to produce their own output. And so this is a supply shock to the other sector. And at the same time, since manufacture now has reduced its capacity due to the impact of this flood, and they are producing less, they will also order less inputs from the other sector. So we also have a fall in the demand faced by the other sector that will impact negatively on their production. And at the same time, the workers who experienced a loss of income in the previous step now may decide to save more and to consume less. And so this is a reduction of the overall final demand faced by every sector in the economy. So as you can see, these are second order damages that can be far greater than the direct damages produced by the weather extreme event. And these shocks can propagate further. For example, if sectors that were indirectly impacted in the previous step decide to reduce their own demand of inputs because now they're all producing less, or if input shortages affect the productive capacity of downstream sectors in a more and more constraining way in the next periods, or if the workers of the other sectors has experienced a loss of income, for example, because unemployment has grown, are now deciding to reduce further their consumption demand. So you can easily see how the original shock has propagated throughout this production network, feeding a vicious circle of both negative demand and supply shocks in the economy. And the magnitude of this indirect impact is as important or even more important than the direct one, okay? So this approach that we have just seen is called Input-Output Model, and this is a technique that he often used also to assess transition risk. That is the second class of risk that we have mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And as I was saying, transition risks arise from the fact that we have to convert our economies to low carbon economies. And we have technological drivers. For example, there is a huge problem of carbon lock-in, since most of the technology in which companies have invested and are still using today are carbon intensive. And so this is likely to produce stranded assets, stranded capital. That is capital on which companies have invested, seeking for a certain remuneration over a certain life cycle of the capital, but this life cycle now has to be shortened in order to abate carbon dioxide emissions. And so the value of the capital is now lower than before, and this is a loss in the balance sheet of these companies that can propagate both through production and financial network. But we also have a huge problem of sector production and employment reallocation, as we will see also in the presentation by Professor Olper. So production in certain sector will shrink or have to shrink in order to meet the targets of CO2, of greenhouse gases emission abatement. And so this will impact the sectoral composition of employment, and the overall effects on aggregate employment are difficult to predict. And finally, we have a very, very important class of transition risk, which is related to regulatory and policy risks. For example, the implementation of a carbon tax is for sure a cost for certain companies that may affect their profitability, or in the measure in which they are able to transmit the desired cost into higher prices, may affect the welfare of consumers. Or think about the implementation of new standards of production as far as emissions are concerned in a certain sector. This is going to affect, once again, the value of the capital in which companies has already invested, and so may give rise to stranded assets. So now the literature dedicated to find policies and regulatory schemes to foster not only a green transition, but an orderly transition, that is to minimize the magnitude of this transition risk, is growing exponentially in the last years. And it is important to, again, to consider that these, the damages connected to these transition risks, exactly like for physical risks, may propagate both vertically through supply chains, that is, through the production network that we have started to investigate in the previous slide, and horizontally, that is, from the real sector of the economy, from production, consumption, if you want, to the financial sector, to banks, financial institutions who invested in the companies that are directly or indirectly affected by transition risks, okay? And as you can see, all this presentation was geared around the idea of finding ways to measure the contribution to climate change of different economic actors and measure the dimension, the costs associated to different types of climate-related risks. And for this purpose, we have a number of different methods and models. So we have macro models like the integrated assessment models that are used for, that are models of the economic system, which include both a modeling of the relationship between the economy and emissions, between emissions and the future development of the climate, and between the future development of the climate and the possible economic damages that are usually estimated through economic damage function that will also be explored in the presentation by Professor Olper later on. We have econometric and statistical based method to try to quantify these negative direct and indirect impacts, and we have the input-output approaches that we have just started to understand. All these methods have advantages and drawbacks. In particular, the class of integrated assessment models has been pretty hugely criticized over the last years because the fault would have been to kind of underestimating the possible negative outcomes of climate change, and so underestimating the social cost of carbon today. But during the last years, they are facing a number of significant refinement and modifications. So there is a huge amount of work to do in these fields. And as you can see, it's important to have a multidisciplinary approach and to be aware about the advantages and disadvantages of different economic methods, as well as of the advantages and black hole of the other blocks that we have seen. So the climate modeling blocks, or the modeling blocks concerning the relationship between the economic systems and greenhouse gases emission. And this is why I really believe that this multidisciplinary approach of this national PhD program is the best suited to educate the next generation of scholars who will have to deal with these challenges. And that's it. I hope I've been in
Okay,
time.
great. Yes, thanks, Alessandro, very much in time. So now I leave the floor to the last speaker, Professor Olper, who's
Lisa,
the impact of
I
climate
cannot
change.
share my presentation, please.
Here you should.
Okay, thank
Mario,
you.
can you allow? Let's see whether Mario is.
Okay.
Yes.
Just a
Now we can
moment.
see your presentation. Portamelo. Yes. So now you can now we can see your presentation,
Yes, I see.
Alessandro.
Thank you very much.
Yes, floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my presentation? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Lisa, for giving the floor. Good morning to everybody. I am Professor Alessandro Olper from Milano University, and I will try to introduce you to something more related to applied works using econometrics. Econometric model to estimate the impact of climate change. And particularly, this is the outline of my lecture. In the first part, I would try to introduce you to some of the current econometric models that we normally use to estimate the impact of climate change, and also discussing a few critical unsolved issues, because there are many unsolved issues until now. In the second part, or perhaps in the bulk part of my presentation, I will try to introduce you to how eventually the reallocation of intersectoral reallocation of labor could eventually represent an important margin of adjustment to climate change, so a sort of adaptation. So basically, you can say that, as already said by both Alessandro and Mario, especially in the last decade, there has been an explosion of many different studies that try to figure out or investigate the impact of climate change on economic behavior. And one of these approach is the use basically of statistical model or econometric model, as called by economists. We can say that the most modern literature that use econometric approach tend to use panel data, and basically panel data set the panel where the unit of observation, say countries, are not just observed across all the countries in the world, but are also observed in the variation of a certain economic outcome over time. So we have a variation across space and also a variation across time. This kind of panel data econometry offers some advantages in the identification of the historical impact of climate change, because we can say that this is a sort of ideal research design, simply because basically the annual variation or interannual variation of a weather variable, say temperature, tend to be exogenous, meaning that economic agents cannot predict which kind of weather will happen in the next month or in the next year. And for that reason, this is a useful property of a variable that we use for explain a certain economic outcome. However, doing that, there are also many problems in using this panel data econometry for identify the impact of climate change, because if we exploit the variation, for example, of temperature across season or across year, clearly we are basically estimating a sort of short-run model. And if we are estimating a short-run model, it is not clear to what extent this model, so the reaction function that we are able to estimate, in reality capture adaptation of economic agents. And this is one of the crucial problems. So it is fundamental that the estimated reaction function in one sense are able also to capture adaptation, but using this kind of panel data econometrics, we have a neither research design, we are not sure that we are also capturing adaptation. But however, on this one, there are designs in the literature. Until now, many of the papers published on the what now is called the climate econometrics basically try to do the following exercise. First of all, they try to estimate an historical relationship. For example, the relation between temperature and GDP per capita. And this historical relation is normally called the reaction function, based on what happened in the past, for example, 50 years. And then after the estimation of the historical relation, they use this estimation to project future impact of climate change. Basically, they use what will happen at the end of the century in terms of the increase in temperature, and they use the historical reaction function. They try to project the economic impact at the end of the century. Now, to better explain this kind of activity by economic researcher, I will try to present to you an example. That is a quite famous example because it is one of the most famous papers until now published on this kind of literature. At least one of the most used in actual integrated assessment model to build the MED function. This is the paper of Burke, Xian, and Niguel that basically estimate an historical reaction function The function is the one reported in the slide, but it is important that you focus the attention only on the first two terms. So forgot the other variable in the equation because I'm just control for the aim of this lecture. So the dependent variable delta y at t, it is just the GDP per capita. So because there is delta, it is the growth of GDP per capita. And the function h is the quadratic function of temperature. So it means that the temperature enters both linearly and as a square term. So the rest of the equation I said before, I just control, are not useful for us. Basically, starting from an historical data set in this paper, the data start in 1960 and end in 2010, they estimate as a reaction function h. And starting from the estimated reaction function, the author normally try to project the future impact of climate change in a very simple way. I don't want to enter in the detail of this second equation, but it's a very simple application of what's happened in the past. Now, the point is that when we project in the future our historical reaction function, basically we are assuming that in the next 70 or 80 years, the economy will behave as happened in the past 50 years. And I think that is quite intuitive that this is a strong assumption. Because, for example, suppose that take the case of the COVID-19, and clearly in the next future, many shocks will happen in our economy, and particularly innovation shock. Is the pattern of innovation change the direction with respect to the actual one? And there are many probabilities that will happen in the future. The historical reaction function is not representative of what could really happen in the future. So, in the paper of Burker and co-author, they estimated a world loss at the end of the century using this machinery of about 20–30% of real GDP using the RCP scenario. This is one of the most strong RCP scenarios. So meaning that this scenario normally called business as usual, and it basically means a strong emission scenario. The results from the paper of Burke and co-author is strongly heterogeneous across continent and also across country. In the link report at the bottom of the slide, you can see also the impact to every single country used in this application. Here we can see that clearly in the south of the world, the damage estimated from this exercise is significantly strong because we have a damage of more than 80% of reduction in GDP at the end of the century. But if we consider the north of the world, for example, Europe, we have an increase of about 50% at the end of the century, but in the North America, basically nothing happened. Now, the point is, and this is a central point of my presentation, the question is, how can we believe to this result? How can we believe that at the end of the century, the damage in this continent of the world are the one estimated by this paper? This question is important because the projection, as I said before, are based on strong assumption about the ability of economies to adapt to climate change. And so there are at least two critical questions. First of all, to what extent the projection accounts for adaptation? And this clearly depends by the ability of our historical estimation of the reaction function to capture what's happened in the past in terms of adaptation. And the second point is related to the fact that it's important for us to understand the mechanism throughout eventually economic agents or the economic overall adapt to climate change. And this kind of extra basically say nothing about these 2 points. So to try to learn more and basically propose you an example, I developed a simple model to show you how eventually there could be a adaptation throughout the labor market. To do that, I basically start from the following example. Suppose that there is a labor productivity shock in the economy. Normally, climate change, we know that climate change has a heterogeneous effect at the sectoral level. For example, the agricultural sector is significantly more affected than non-agricultural sector. Clearly, also in the manufacturing industry, there are sectors more affected than others. But if we take a simple economy with three sectors, normally the agricultural sector is more affected than the manufacturing and the services sector. So start from this starting point. Then, this heterogeneous effect in sectoral productivity basically can trigger several different margins of adjustment, inducing, for example, change in the international trade patterns. There are a growing literature that tries to figure out what's happening in terms of the changing comparative advantage and how international trade could eventually change and so internalize the impact of climate change. This kind of heterogeneous effect could trigger migration. There is a huge literature on climate change related immigration, and the results are quite mixed. And finally, this kind of heterogeneous effect could induce labor reallocation across sectors. Now, in the next part of my presentation, I will try to give you a simple example of how an economy could adapt throughout reallocation in the labor market. Now, I will start from a very, very simple model. This is an economy based on two sectors, one agricultural sector and the other is the non-agricultural sector, called, for example, the manufacturing sector. Now, every economic model normally starts from an initial condition and initial equilibrium. We assume that the economy normally are in equilibrium. In this kind of initial equilibrium, in this two sector economy, the wage are equalized across sector. So in the agricultural sector A, the wage is identical to the manufacturing on non-agricultural sector. Pay attention because in this kind of model, this is a standard specific factor model, the wage is just equal to the price of the marginal productivity. Now, in the initial equilibrium, we can represent graphically our economy with a very simple graph. In this graph, in the vertical axis, we measure the wage, and in the horizontal axis, we measure the amount of labor in the two sectors. Well, the agricultural sector, the origin of the agricultural sector is on the left, and the origin of the manufacturing sector is on the right of the horizontal axis. So basically, the two depicted curves are the labor demand in the agricultural sector and the labor demand in the non-agricultural sector. When the two curves cross, we have the initial equilibrium. And so in the initial equilibrium, we have a certain level of wage and a certain amount of worker employed in agriculture and a certain amount of worker employed in the non-agricultural sector. Now, if we include a possible climate shock in this model, we can assume that basically there is a climate-driven productivity shock that happened mainly in the agricultural sector, because there are a huge of evidence that shows us that normally the climate shock primarily affects the agricultural sector. This kind of climate-driven productivity shock, basically in this kind of model, will push workers into the non-agricultural sector, has an effect of the change in local comparative advantage. Basically, graphically, what's happened is that the climate shock will push down the productivity in the agricultural sector. And if we assume that nothing happened in the non-agricultural sector, the demand of labor will shift down from the black one, that is the initial equilibrium, to the red one, that is the final equilibrium. As can you see in the simple model, a shift down of the labor demand in the agricultural sector will induce, first of all, a reduction of the wage, the wage will move from the initial W to W first, and also, and this is an important point, a reallocation of labor. So a contraction, a reduction of the amount of labor used in the agricultural sector because there is a reduction in labor demand, and an expansion of labor in the non-agricultural sector. Now, what are the implications of this labor reallocation induced eventually by a climate shock? First of all, the labor reallocation is crucial for our ability to measure the climate change economic impacts. So basically, we can say that do not considering this form of adaptation, because the labor reallocation can be viewed as a form of adaptation, our ability to estimate the impact of climate change is significantly higher, because we are omitting how agents, our economic agents, adapt to the productivity shock. This clearly is an oversimplified model, and at the end, what we are interested in, what really happens in the reality. So the point is how this model can be eventually estimated with real data. Basically, to estimate this kind of reallocation of labor, we need at the minimum to test two key relationships. First of all, we need to understand how sectoral growth and wage are eventually differentially affected by climate change shock. And secondly, how the previous effect change the sectoral demand of labor. And so inducing a reallocation of labor from the most affected agricultural sector to the lower affected sector like the manufacturing and services sector. So basically, the first application of this simple model has been done recently by a paper of Corner using the Indian states labor market. And the results of this paper are very interesting because basically they show that the ability of a non-agricultural sector to absorb workers has been crucial in mitigating the impact of the climate-driven agricultural productivity shock. Importantly, in this, in the empirical estimation of this paper, they show that in the absence of this labor reallocation from the agricultural sector to the manufacturing and services sector, the local economic loss could be up to 7% higher with respect to we find normally. So basically, this is a clear signal that if we are not able in our model to capture also adaptation, probably we are overestimating the damage from climate change. There are other recent papers that more or less show that there is this labor reallocation induced by climate change. But the point here is that what's happening in rich countries, because I said before, this kind of application that predicts the reallocation of labor from agriculture to the manufacturing sector normally work well in developing or in emerging countries where the share of labor in the agricultural sector is very high. The question is, to what extent a model like this could be eventually exploited for understanding what are going on in rich countries, a country like Italy or European countries or European regions. From this point of view, there is just one application, a recent application for Miyuki, that used as an example the US county, in particular the US corn belt counties, that are a US area where there is an abundance of corn production. Basically, in this empirical application, the author showed that the net effect of one standard deviation increase in temperature induced a 6.9% decline in the hourly wage for the average US worker, agricultural workers. And this effect is similar or close of what are going on in developing countries. And this is interesting because we are trying to apply something similar to basically to the Mediterranean EU regions at the NAS2 and NAS3 level, to try to understand at which point the climate shock that induced a reduction in agricultural productivity basically induced a form of reallocation like the one summarized by our simple model, where already some preliminary results that concern only Italy, and the preliminary results are encouraging because what we find in the data is exactly what predicted by the model. Clearly, Italy is not enough, especially because we are interested in a crucial research question, and particularly we're interested in understand to what extent this labor reallocation in some sense could also depend by the flexibility or rigidity of the labor market institution. In Europe, there is some heterogeneity in this in the regulation of the labor market, and so we hope to exploit this heterogeneity in the labor market institution to see if the labor reallocation is different or not, depending by the flexibility or the rigidity. So this is more or less the end of my presentation. And if you have any kind of question, please do not hesitate to ask me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, that is very good. And I think it's deep dive into some of the economics jargon. I hope everyone was able to. No, that's fine. I think I also had some like basics explanation of some of the jargon already in the chat, but of course, if there are questions, we have like 5 minutes left. So there's of course there's questions in the chat, but also since we have 5 minutes left, perhaps we can take one question or from the audience or through the chat. I don't know how you prefer. Any clarification from the audience? I see comments. I think on the chat, there are many questions that have been already answered.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know. I mean, if you don't have any, I don't see hands being raised. So you can use the hands raised function if you want to. You don't be shy. I mean, we're here to learn, so you shouldn't be shy at all. Okay, still I don't see hands raised. So if you have more questions, just put them on the chat. And otherwise, I would probably leave you the time for lunch. We are perfectly in time, and so that is great for me, I mean, as a chair. And I think the presentations have been very helpful and clear. But of course, again, if you have questions, especially for non-economists, sometimes we don't exactly know what you understand and what is obvious. So please let us know either now or later.
Elisa, is actually
there's just there's one question. Do you think that the calculations for economic impact of CC should be standardized to all companies or entities? This is for Professor Alper.
Yes, I think no, like honestly, I don't know how it is possible to make this kind of standardization. I don't see how, to be honest. And in general terms, we are quite far from better figure out what are the real economic impact of climate change. And we need time.
Yeah, and one thing that you will learn through this PhD program, of course, is that firms are very heterogeneous, and also they're not rational actors. So there's a whole lot of complexities, not just systemic ones, but also we don't have to assume that firms are like one kind, and they can be somehow, there are some stylized facts about how economies work, and typologies of firm also exist, but firms are very different one from the other, and they also react differently based on a number of characteristics, both internal resources, but other issues as well. So this is something you are going to be learning through this 3 years course, I think, besides other things. Okay, so if there's no further question, any of the speakers want to have a final word, or they want to say something? You're done. You're fine.
From my side.
Okay, so I will then now call the lunch break and meet you again at 2:30, right? Yes, this is the schedule. Okay, see you later and have a
See you
nice
later.
lunch.
Thank
Have a
you.
break.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you to the speakers. Bye.
Thank you, Lisa.